I'm not selling. Not to you, not to anyone. You want this land, Callahan? You're going to have to bury me on it first. Those were the words Daniel Whitmore said to a man in a $1,000 suit standing in the dust of a gas station that hadn't pumped a single gallon of fuel in over 2 decades. A 56-year-old man with grease under his fingernails, a sun-cracked leather vest on his back, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Nobody believed he could win, not even Daniel himself. But sometimes the most dangerous man in the room isn't the one with the lawyers. It's the one who finally stopped running. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been riding with us for a while, you already know what we do. We tell the stories that don't make the evening news, the ones that happen on forgotten roads and empty parking lots in the hearts of men and women who the world decided were finished. Subscribe to the channel right now, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Part 1. The morning Daniel Whitmore turned 56, he didn't get a phone call. He didn't get a card. He sat alone at a sticky diner counter in Flagstaff, Arizona, nursing a black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, staring at nothing in particular. And he thought to himself, this is what the end of a life looks like. Not a crash, not a dramatic fall, just a man in a diner with cold coffee and nobody who remembered the day he was born. He'd been riding for 3 weeks straight by that point. Not riding with purpose, riding to be moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant acknowledging the full catastrophic scope of what his life had become. The Harley outside was the only thing in the world that was entirely unambiguously his. Everything else had been stripped away with a kind of systematic efficiency that still stunned him when he sat still long enough to think about it. The marriage had been over for 2 years, but the paperwork only finalized 8 months ago. Sandra hadn't been cruel about it. That almost made it worse. She'd handed him the papers with tired eyes and said, I stayed longer than I should have, Danny. We both know that. And he hadn't argued because she was right, and he hated that she was right. 22 years together, and it ended with her being reasonable about it. He would have preferred a fight he could have handled. The chapter had fallen apart around the same time, though the dissolution of that brotherhood had been slower, more painful, like a wound that refused to close cleanly. The Hells Angels weren't something you quit. They were something you became. Daniel had become that thing at 23, had worn it like a second skin for over 30 years. And when the internal politics and personal loyalties fractured the way they did, when men he'd ridden with through desert heat and Rocky Mountain passes suddenly looked through him, like he wasn't there, he hadn't left so much as dissolved. One day he was there, then gradually he wasn't. The money went with Sandra mostly. What remained after the divorce had evaporated through 2 bad winters, a medical bill he hadn't planned for, and the kind of slow grinding financial erosion that happens when a man stops caring enough to pay attention. He wasn't broke in the dramatic sense. He had enough for Goyen and enough for diners like this one. But he had no home to go back to, no savings to speak of, and no plan for what happened next. He was 56 years old. He was starting from zero. And that morning in the diner, staring at his cold coffee, Daniel Whitmore genuinely wasn't sure he had the energy to start at all. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses, perched on top of her head, and the efficient warmth of someone who'd been working this counter for decades refilled his coffee without him asking. She looked at him for a second, really looked the way tired people sometimes do, recognizing something familiar in a stranger's face. You look like you're trying to decide something, she said. I'm trying to decide if there's any point to any of it, Daniel said, and the honesty of it surprised him even as it left his mouth. She didn't flinch. She just set the coffee pot down and said, there usually is. You just can't see it yet from where you're standing. Then she moved down the counter to the next customer, and Daniel sat with that for a while. He paid the bill, walked outside, stood next to the Harley in the morning, cold, and looked at the road. He had no plan. He had no direction. He had a half tank of gas and absolutely nothing pulling him in any particular direction. So he did what he'd always done when life gave him no good options. He got on the bike and he rode. He wasn't looking for anything. He wasn't heading anywhere. He just rode south on a highway he barely remembered, past empty land and scattered scrub brush, in the kind of flat, enormous Arizona sky that makes a man feel very small and very free at the same time. He rode for 2 hours without stopping. He rode past a dozen exits he didn't take. And then on a stretch of old highway that his phone's GPS didn't even bother to name, he passed a road sign that had been there so long the lettering had half faded to nothing. But he could still read it. Whitmore Road. He hit the brakes so hard the bike shuddered under him. He sat on the shoulder for a full minute without moving, the engine idling beneath him, the wind pushing dry dust across the asphalt. His hands were still on the grips. His heart was doing something strange and fast inside his chest. Whitmore Road. His father had named that road. Or rather, more accurately, his father had been the reason that road got named at all 30-something years ago, back when Earl Whitmore's gas station was the only business for 20 miles in either direction, and the county needed something to put on the sign. Daniel hadn't been down that road in more than 20 years. He had been deliberately, methodically avoiding it for most of his adult life, in the way that a man avoids a place that carries too much weight, too much history, too much pain, too much unresolved everything. He sat there for another minute. Then he turned onto Whitmore Road. The pavement was cracked and buckled in places, the kind of road that hadn't seen serious maintenance in years. He rode slowly, not because the bike required it, but because something in him needed to go slow. The land around him was dry and flat and quiet, nothing moving except the occasional hawk overhead. And then rising up on the right side of the road behind an overgrown stand of scrub oak and what used to be a chain-link fence, he saw it. Whitmore Fuel and Repair. He pulled off and stopped, and for a long moment he just sat there on the idling bike and stared. The pumps were still there, rusted down to a reddish-brown, tilted at slight angles like old men who'd been standing too long. The canopy over them had half collapsed, one corner of it sunk down toward the cracked concrete below. The main building, a squat, flat-roof structure that had once housed the office, a small convenience store, and a two-bay repair shop, was standing technically, but the windows were boarded and broken. The paint was gone, and the wooden sign above the entrance, the one his father had carved himself and painted in red and black, was still there, hanging at an angle, the letters barely legible. Whitmore Fuel and Repair, established 1971. Daniel cut the engine. He got off the bike. He stood in the dirt and looked at the place his father had built, with his own two hands, the place he had grown up, in the place he had spent the better part of his adult life running away from, and he felt something in his chest crack open. Not grief exactly, not nostalgia, something older and rawer than either of those things. He walked through this gap where the fence had rusted apart and crossed the broken concrete lot. He didn't know why he was doing it. He had no plan. He just kept walking past the dead pumps, past an old tire that had been sitting in the same spot so long it had sunk into the ground, until he reached the front door of the office. It was padlocked. He stood there for a moment staring at the lock, and then he remembered something, a detail from 30 years ago, the kind of specific childhood memory that survives everything else. And he walked around to the back of the building, to a window that had always had a broken latch. He found it. He pushed on it. After some resistance, it gave. He climbed inside. The smell hit him first. Dust and motor oil, and something underneath both of those things, something he could only describe as the smell of his childhood. The interior was dark, lit only by thin lines of light coming through the cracks in the boards over the windows. Shapes emerged slowly. The old front counter, the shelves that used to hold automotive supplies, a rack that still had a few cans of motor oil on it, coated in years of grime. A calendar on the wall from 1998 that he recognized had probably been there even before that. And behind the counter on the shelf where his father had always kept it, a dark green metal box that Daniel recognized immediately. It was the kind of lockbox his father had used to keep cash in back in the early days. But when Daniel reached over the counter and pulled it toward him and lifted the lid, there was no money inside. There was a journal. A plain composition notebook, the black and white kind, its cover warped, and its pages slightly swelled from humidity but intact. His father's handwriting on the cover. Whitmore Private. Daniel's hands were not entirely steady as he picked it up. He found the old stool behind the counter, still there, still functional, and he sat down in the dim light and he opened the journal. The first entry was dated August 14th, 1989. Daniel would have been 19 years old that year. The handwriting was his father's small, cramped leaning, slightly to the right, the handwriting of a man who had not spent much time in school, but had taught himself to write with a kind of determined precision. He read the first line. "Talk to Daniel again today." Or tried to. "He doesn't want to hear it. Kid thinks I care more about this station than I do about him. He's wrong. but I don't know how to make him understand that the two things are the same. Daniel stopped reading. He sat in the dark, dusty office of his dead father's abandoned gas station, and he pressed his hand flat against the open page, and he did not breathe for a long moment. Then he turned to the next entry. He read for 3 hours. He didn't move from that stool. He didn't check his phone. The light shifted as the sun moved, and he just kept reading page by page, working through the cramped handwriting, and with every page he turned, something inside him that had been locked down for decades began to shift. His father's name was Earl Whitmore. He had come to Arizona from Oklahoma in 1968 with $200 and a mechanical aptitude that bordered on genius. He had built this gas station with money borrowed from his wife's family, and he had nearly lost it twice in the first 5 years, and both times he had worked himself back from the edge through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The station had been the family's entire financial life, not a choice but a necessity. Every hour Earl spent, there was an hour he was keeping the family alive. But Daniel had never seen it that way. Growing up, all he had seen was a father who wasn't there. A father who was always at the station, always under a car, always on the phone with a supplier or a bank. Daniel had spent his teenage years convinced that his father loved the business more than he loved his family, and that conviction had calcified into a kind of cold, permanent resentment that shaped everything that came after, including, in ways Daniel was only beginning to understand, the 30-year detour of a life he'd been living. He ran toward the Hells Angels at 23 and never looked back. The Brotherhood offered exactly what his father had never seemed to: immediate, uncomplicated belonging. Men who showed up, men who were present, men who made it clear through action that you mattered to them. Daniel had grabbed onto that with both hands and built his entire identity around it. He had called his father twice in the last decade of Earl's life. Twice. When Earl died of a stroke in 2009, Daniel had attended the funeral, stood at the back, and left before anyone could speak to him. He had never grieved it. He had never allowed himself to. Now he was sitting in the man's ruined office, reading his private thoughts, and everything he had believed about his father was coming apart. Earl had known Daniel resented him. He'd written about it repeatedly with a plain, undefended honesty that was somehow harder to read than anger would have been. He hadn't rationalized it or defended himself. He'd just described it and then written about why he kept working anyway. I know Danny thinks I chose this place over him. I don't know how to explain that this place is him. Every pump I fixed, every engine I rebuilt, every dollar I scraped together, it was all for him. I want to leave him something real, something that can't be taken away. Daniel had to stop reading for a while at that point. He set the journal down on the counter and pressed his palms against his eyes and breathed slowly and carefully until the sensation in his chest was something he could manage. He picked it up again. He read about the years after he left. He read about how Earl had tried to reach out and hadn't known how. He read about a man who was proud of his son, even when he didn't understand him, who kept a photograph of a young Daniel on the desk in the office, who would sometimes show it to customers and say, "That's my boy," with a simplicity that, now reading it secondhand, broke something in Daniel completely. And then he reached the section of the journal that changed everything. The entries from 2003 and 2004 told a different story. A story Daniel had never known, had never been told, had never had any reason to suspect. His father's handwriting in those years was tighter, more urgent, the letters pressed harder into the page. A man named Richard Callahan had come to Whitmore Road in 2003. His father described him with the precise wariness of someone who had learned to read people through decades of small business dealings. Callahan came in a black SUV with a driver. "Suit looks like it cost more than my truck. Wanted to buy the land, not the business, the land. Offered me $800,000. Wanted me out in 60 days. Earl had said no. Callahan came back. He came back 3 times over the next 8 months, each time with a slightly higher offer and a slightly different lawyer. And each time Earl said no. The offers went up. The lawyer's letters got more aggressive. Then the lawyer's letters started making claims, claiming Earl had outstanding code violations, claiming the fuel tanks might be leaking, claiming there were environmental issues that could expose Earl to liability. None of it was true, but fighting it cost money Earl didn't have. Spent $6,000 this month on the attorney. One entry read, "Insurance canceled." They said it was a routine review, but I know he got to them. Don't know how, but he got to them. Another entry a few months later. Dennis at the bank said my loan renewal has been flagged. Can't explain why. Won't say more. I've been banking there for 31 years. Page after page of it. A slow, systematic campaign to squeeze an old man off his land. Manufactured problems, financial pressure, the quiet withdrawal of support systems that a small business depends on. Earl had documented every incident with the meticulous habit of a man who understood that the written record might be all he had. The last entry in the journal was dated March 2nd, 2007, 2 years before Earl died. I'm tired. The lawyers are expensive and I'm running out of money, and Callahan's boys have been driving past the station twice a day for the last 2 weeks like they're counting down. But I'm not going to sell. I wrote Daniel's name in the deed. He'll figure out what to do with it when the time comes. He's smarter than I ever was. Stubborn, too. He gets that from me. Whatever happens, whoever reads this, keep this place alive. It was built for something, still is. Daniel read that last paragraph 4 times. He set the journal down very carefully, as if it were something fragile. He got off the stool and walked to the boarded front window and stood there in the dim light and let everything he'd just read settle into him. Let it move through him, the way something seismic moves, not fast, not dramatic, but deep, permanent. His father hadn't abandoned him. His father had been quietly, stubbornly, desperately trying to leave him something worth having, while a man with money and connections tried to take it all away. And Earl Whitmore had fought that fight entirely alone in failing health, with failing finances right up until the end. And he had won, technically. The land was still here. The deed had been transferred. Somewhere in the legal records of the county of Yavapai, Arizona, Daniel Marcus Whitmore was the owner of this property, a property that a man named Richard Callahan apparently still wanted. Daniel didn't know yet what he was going to do with that. He didn't have a plan. He barely had a next hour mapped out. But he knew one thing with a clarity that surprised him, a clarity that felt like the first solid thing he'd felt in years. He wasn't leaving. He walked back to the front of the office and picked up the journal again, and as he did, his hand brushed against something at the bottom of the metal box he hadn't noticed before. He reached in and pulled it out. A folded envelope, his name written on it in his father's handwriting. Not Daniel, not Dan, Danny. The way Earl had called him when he was very small before the distance grew. Daniel held the envelope for a long time without opening it. He could feel the weight of whatever was inside, not just physically, but in every other way. He understood that opening it was a kind of crossing, that whatever was inside would change the shape of things in a way that couldn't be undone. He opened it. Inside was a single folded page and a key. The page had 4 lines on it in his father's handwriting. Danny, if you're reading this, you came back. I always believed you would. The key is for the workshop lockbox. There's money in it. Not much, but enough to start. Whatever you decide to do with this place, do it. Don't let the bastards win. Love, Dad. Daniel stared at that key for so long that the light in the office changed the thin lines of sunlight, shifting as the afternoon moved. He turned the key over in his hand. Old-fashioned heavy, the kind cut for a padlock. He closed his fingers around it. And something inside Daniel Whitmore, something that had been locked down, closed off, armored, and hidden for 30 years, began very slowly and, for the first time in a very long time, to open. He got up. He walked it around to the side door of the building that led directly into the workshop. The padlock on that door took the key without resistance, turning smoothly, as if it had been waiting. He pushed the door open and walked inside. The workshop was large, 2 bays high ceiling, a heavy-duty lift that was still, as far as he could tell, structurally intact. Tools hung on the wall with the organized precision that had been his father's trademark. Not all of them. Some had been taken presumably by whoever last locked up the place. But enough remained to suggest what this space had been: a real, serious working mechanic's shop, the kind you didn't see much anymore. Run by a man who knew engines the way other men know language. In the corner, a large metal lockbox was bolted to the wall. Daniel used the key. Inside was a bank envelope with $800 in it, in a folded document that turned out to be a copy of the property deed with Daniel's name on it, notarized and certified. He stood there holding the money and the deed and looked around the workshop. Then he walked back outside into the late afternoon Arizona light and stood in the cracked concrete lot next to his Harley and looked at the whole property. The broken pumps, the half-collapsed canopy, the cracked windows, the peeling paint, the overgrown fence line, the years of abandonment accumulated like sediment. A realistic man, a practical man, would have seen an impossible project, would have done the math and walked away, would have told himself the place was too far gone, too expensive, too complicated, a losing fight against time and money, and a developer who had already demonstrated exactly how willing he was to play dirty. Daniel Whitmore had never been a particularly practical man. He pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, a list that had thinned considerably in recent years, until he found a name: Curtis Miller. His father's oldest friend, a man in his mid-70s, now a retired mechanic who had worked alongside Earl Whitmore in the early years of the station. A man Daniel had not spoken to in at least 15 years. He pressed call. It rang 4 times. Daniel was preparing himself for voicemail when the line connected. "Yeah," said a voice rough and unhurried. "Curtis," Daniel said. "It's Daniel Whitmore." A pause, then, "Well, I'll be goddamned." "I'm standing at my father's gas station," Daniel said. "I just read his journal." Another pause, longer this time. "How much of it?" Curtis asked. "All of it." The silence on the line had a different quality after that, something careful in it, something that might have been grief or relief, or both at once. "Where are you staying tonight?" Curtis asked. "I don't know yet." "Stay on that property," Curtis said, and his voice had shifted, become firmer, more directive. "Don't leave it unmanned. There are things I need to tell you, and I should have told you a long time ago, but just don't leave that property tonight. You hear me?" "Curtis," Daniel said, "what aren't you telling me?" "Things your father didn't write down," Curtis said, "because some things were too dangerous to put on paper." "I'll be there by morning. Just stay put, Danny. You came back. That means something. That changes things." He hung up. Daniel stood in the Arizona evening holding his phone, looking at his father's ruined gas station, and he felt for the first time in years something that wasn't quite hope, but was close enough to it to matter. He wasn't going anywhere. He went back inside and found the old workshop couch his father had kept for late nights. Cracked vinyl springs shot but still functional, and he laid down with the journal against his chest. He didn't sleep for a long time. When he finally did, he dreamed about a boy in a gas station watching his father work. And for once in the dream, the man looked up and smiled at him. And Daniel couldn't remember the last time he'd dreamed anything that peaceful. Curtis Miller arrived before sunrise. Daniel heard the truck before he saw it, the particular rattle of an old engine that hadn't been fully tuned in years, the crunch of gravel under tires moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who knew exactly where they were going. He'd been awake for an hour already, sitting on the workshop floor with his back against the wall, and the journal open in his lap, rereading sections he'd already read twice, looking for things he might have missed the first time through. He got up and walked outside. Curtis was older than Daniel remembered. That shouldn't have surprised him. 15 years was 15 years. But it did. The man who climbed down from the truck was in his mid-70s, heavier through the middle, his white hair cropped short, moving with the deliberate economy of someone whose joints had opinions about cold mornings. But his eyes were the same, sharp, dark, watching Daniel with an expression that held equal parts grief and something that might have been relief. They didn't hug. They weren't that kind of men, and they hadn't known each other well enough for that even years ago. They shook hands, and Curtis held on, a beat longer than strictly necessary, and that said enough. "You look like hell," Curtis said. "I've been on the road for 3 weeks." "I know. Your father's lawyer called me when the county sent a notice about the property taxes going unpaid." "I've been paying them." He said it flat matter of fact, like it wasn't remarkable. 8 years. Somebody had to. Daniel stared at him. "You've been paying property taxes on this place for 8 years. Your father asked me to. Said you'd come back eventually. Said when you did, the place needed to be here." Curtis looked past Daniel at the station, his expression complicated. "Earl was stubborn about certain things. Why didn't you call me?" "I tried, twice. First time was right after he died. You didn't pick up. Second time was about 3 years later. You picked up, said you had nothing to say about the old man, and hung up on me." He said it without accusation, just the facts. "I figured you'd get here when you were ready." Daniel didn't have anything to say to that because it was entirely true, and they both knew it. "Come inside," he said instead. "I found the journal." Curtis nodded slowly. "I know about the journal. I helped him write some of the later entries. Or he read them to me while he was writing them. His eyesight was going bad those last couple years." He followed Daniel back into the office, and when he crossed the threshold, he stopped for a moment and stood very still. Haven't been inside since the day we locked it up, he said quietly. September of 2009, 2 weeks after the funeral. He stood there for a moment longer, then straightened his shoulders and moved to the counter where Daniel had left the journal. He looked at it, but didn't touch it. Sit down, Daniel said. You said there were things he didn't write down. There are. Then start talking. Curtis pulled the old stool out from behind the counter, the same one Daniel had spent 3 hours on the day before, and sat down. He put his forearms on the counter and looked at Daniel directly the way a man looks at someone when what he's about to say matters. What do you know about Richard Callahan, he asked. What's in the journal? He wanted the land. Came at Dad with money, then lawyers, then what sounds like interference with his insurance and his bank. That's about half of it, Curtis said. The other half is what Callahan did after your father died. Daniel pulled a folding chair from against the wall, sat down and waited. Your father held on, you know that much. He fought Callahan for 4 years, and he held on. But here's what he didn't write in that journal, couldn't, because by the time this particular part happened, he was in the hospital and not coming back out. Curtis paused. He breathed. 2 weeks before Earl died, Callahan's lawyers filed a quiet title action on this property. A quiet title action. Legal procedure. They claimed there was an ambiguity in the original land deed from 1971, a technicality about how the parcel boundaries were described. It was garbage. Anybody who looked at it carefully could see it was manufactured. But it was in the courts, and courts take time, and Earl died before it got resolved. Curtis looked at him steadily. The action is still technically open. It's been sitting in the county court system for 17 years. Never dismissed, never adjudicated. Just sitting there. The room was very quiet. So Callahan might still have a legal claim on this property, Daniel said. His lawyers do. Whether he's still personally involved, I don't know. Man's got a dozen different LLCs and holding companies. But the claim's alive, Danny. And the minute you start making noise about rebuilding this place, somebody's going to notice. They'll know I'm here. If they don't already. Curtis said it simply, and the implications sat in the air between them like smoke. Daniel stood up. He walked to the boarded window and back. His jaw was tight. He spent all those years fighting to protect this property and leave it to me, and then spent 17 years sitting in a legal gray zone because nobody was here to push back on it. That's right. And you never, he stopped himself. He looked at Curtis. You couldn't afford to fight it yourself. I'm a retired mechanic. Callahan's got a real estate law firm on retainer. Curtis spread his hands. I'm sorry, Danny. I kept the taxes paid. That's all I could do. Daniel ran his hand over his face and sat back down. His mind was working fast. He'd spent 30 years in an organization that operated by certain rules. And one of those rules, maybe the most fundamental one, was that you understood your situation completely before you made a move. You took stock. You counted your assets and your liabilities. You understood exactly what you were facing before you committed to anything. His assets, an $800 head start, a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, a mechanical aptitude he'd inherited from the very man whose journal was sitting on that counter in a piece of property his father had spent his life protecting. His liabilities, no money to speak of, no legal resources, no crew, a 17-year-old legal challenge sitting in the county courts, and a developer with the kind of money and connections that had already demonstrated the ability to dismantle a man's livelihood from the shadows. He thought about Sandra's tired eyes handing him the divorce papers. He thought about the cold coffee in the diner. He thought about riding for 3 weeks with no destination because there was nothing left to ride toward. And he thought about 4 words written in an old man's cramped handwriting. Don't let the bastards win. I need a lawyer, he said. I know one, Curtis said. Rebecca Navarro, she's in Prescott, handles property disputes, does a lot of work for small landowners against development companies. She's good, and she's not afraid of a fight. A pause. She might do an initial consultation for free if I call her. Call her today. Already planning on it. Curtis straightened up from the counter. There's something else, though. Something I didn't tell you on the phone last night because I needed to see your face first. See my face. To know if you were serious about this, because what I'm about to tell you only matters if you're actually planning to stay and rebuild. If you're just here to satisfy some curiosity and then ride off again, then it doesn't matter and I don't say it. He looked at Daniel with that same sharp, steady gaze. Are you serious? Daniel didn't hesitate. I'm serious. Curtis nodded once like that was the answer he'd been waiting for. Your father wasn't the only one Callahan went after. In the years after Earl died, Callahan's company bought up 4 other properties on this corridor, pushed people out the same way he tried to push Earl out: insurance interference, bank pressure, code enforcement complaints. 2 families that I know of lost properties they'd owned for generations. He paused. One of those families is still fighting. A man named Tom LaGuardia. His family owned a small feed supply store about 6 miles east of here. Lost it in 2013. He's been in litigation ever since, and he's got documentation, years of it, that shows a pattern of conduct by Callahan's company that goes well beyond what your father wrote in that journal. Daniel was very still. He's got proof of the pattern. He's got proof of the pattern. And if my case and his case are connected, you stop being 2 isolated incidents and start being evidence of a systematic campaign, Curtis said. That's a different kind of lawsuit. That's the kind of lawsuit that makes developers nervous. He leaned forward slightly. Tom LaGuardia has been waiting for someone else with standing to come forward. Someone with a direct claim, someone whose property is still in play. Someone like me. Someone exactly like you. The silence in the office had a different quality now. Not the dead silence of abandonment, but something charged and alert. Daniel picked up his father's journal from the counter. He turned it over in his hands. He thought about his father sitting right here in the same room writing in cramped, careful handwriting about a fight he was losing, but refused to stop fighting. A man who could have sold, taken the money, walked away, and chose not to. Chose the harder thing. Chose it every single day until he ran out of days. The son had spent 30 years doing exactly the opposite. Choosing the door. Choosing to ride away from anything that got too complicated, too painful, too close to the bone. He was done with doors. Call Navarro, he said, and get me Tom LaGuardia's number. Curtis smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, the kind that costs something. I'll call them both, but Daniel, he paused. Starting this fight means finishing it. You understand what I'm telling you. You don't get to walk away from this one halfway through. I know. Callahan's got money and time and lawyers. You've got $800 and a busted property. And a journal, Daniel said, and 17 years worth of unpaid taxes that somebody else paid to keep this place alive for me. He looked at Curtis. I'm not running from anything anymore. Curtis held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right then, let's get to work. It started with a phone call and a can of WD-40. While Curtis sat in the truck making calls, Daniel went back into the workshop and started taking stock. He opened every cabinet, every drawer, examined every tool on the wall, ran his hands over the engine lift to check its structural integrity, looked at the condition of the hydraulic lines, assessed what was salvageable and what was gone. He worked methodically the way his father had taught him, without ever meaning to, by example, by proximity, by the kind of osmotic learning that happens when you grow up watching someone work with their hands. The lift was usable. The air compressor would need work, but wasn't beyond saving. 3 of the 4 floor jacks were functional. The workbench was solid oak, handmade, bolted to the floor, and it had outlasted everything else in the room by sheer virtue of the fact that his father had built it to last 3 lifetimes. The electrical panel needed a licensed electrician, but the wiring appeared intact. The plumbing to the utility sink would need to be checked. The fuel pumps were a different problem. They were old enough that they'd need complete replacement to meet current code, and pump equipment wasn't cheap. But the underground storage tanks, he'd need an environmental assessment before he touched those. His father had mentioned tank integrity in the journal, but a lot of years had passed since then. He was making a mental list, item by item, cost by estimated cost, when he heard Curtis knock on the workshop door frame. Navarro can see you Thursday afternoon, Curtis said. 2 o'clock in Prescott. She looked up the quiet title action as soon as I mentioned Callahan's name. Said she knows the case. Daniel turned. She knows the case. She knows Callahan. He's been involved in at least 3 other property disputes in Yavapai County that she's aware of. She said she'd need to see your deed and your father's documentation, but she thinks there may be grounds to dismiss the quiet title action on procedural grounds. It's been sitting inactive for so long that there's a question about whether it's even still viable. He paused. She also said, and I'm quoting here, that she'd enjoy the chance to make Callahan's lawyers explain to a judge why a claim that was filed 17 years ago and never pursued should still be considered valid. Something loosened slightly in Daniel's chest. She sounds like she's got some fight in her. She grew up in a small family in Yavapai County, Curtis said. Her family lost land to a development company when she was 12. She went to law school specifically to stop that from happening to other people. Another pause. She takes cases like this on contingency when she believes in them, meaning she gets paid when you win. If we win. When? She said when. Curtis held his gaze. Tom LaGuardia called me back while I was on with Navarro. He wants to meet you tomorrow morning. He's been following Callahan's activity for 10 years, Danny. He's got files, organized, documented files. He's been waiting for someone to come along with a piece of property still in play. Daniel nodded slowly. The shape of things was beginning to emerge, not a clear plan yet, but the outline of one. The infrastructure of a fight. He'd organized enough runs and enough operations over 30 years for us to understand how momentum worked. How you built something from nothing, how you found your people and your leverage and your footholds, and you move forward one piece at a time. He also understood something else. Something that came from 30 years of living in a world where your reputation was your currency. We need people, he said. Curtis looked at him. Not for the legal stuff, Navarro handles that, but for the physical rebuild. I can't do this alone and I can't afford to hire a crew. He set down the wrench he'd been holding. I need to make some calls. To who? Daniel looked at him steadily. You know who? Curtis was quiet for a moment. You've been out of that world for a while. I know. Some of those men might not pick up. Some of them will. He pulled his phone out. The ones who matter will. He started with a man named Roy Duckett, who he'd ridden with for 15 years and who was now living outside Tucson. Roy picked up on the second ring, and when Daniel explained where he was and what he was doing, there was a pause and then a single word. 3 hours later, Roy texted back that he was coming Friday and was bringing his brother Marcus, who was a licensed electrician. He called a man named Pete Sobieski in Albuquerque, who he'd known since his 20s and who had a reputation for being able to fix anything with an engine. Pete said he couldn't come until the following week, but that he'd be there. He said it like it was obvious, like there was no version of events where he didn't show up. He called a woman named Diane Croswell, who had run the books for the chapter years ago and understood permit processes and county paperwork better than anyone he'd ever met. She was in Phoenix. She said she could come Thursday evening after Navarro's meeting and could look at what permits were outstanding. Each call was brief. He didn't explain the full situation to any of them. He just said he was rebuilding something that needed to be rebuilt, that it mattered and that he could use the help. None of them asked for details. That was the thing about the people you'd ridden with. There was a fluency to it, a shared understanding that when a brother or sister asked for help with something that mattered, you came. You didn't audit the request. You showed up. By mid-afternoon, he had 7 people committed to coming. 7 people who were willing to give their time and labor to a project they knew almost nothing about in a place they had no personal connection to because Daniel Whitmore had asked. He stood in the parking lot with his phone in his hand after the last call and felt the weight of that. These were people he hadn't spoken to in years. In some cases, people he'd left behind without explanation when his life collapsed. And they were coming anyway. Curtis had watched the calls from the office doorway. When Daniel came back inside, the older man looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read. 7 people, Daniel said. Your father tried to do this alone, Curtis said quietly. That was his mistake. He was too proud to ask for help. He paused. He would have liked watching you make those calls. Daniel didn't answer, but something in his chest moved. That night, they cleaned the office. It was a practical necessity. Daniel needed a livable space if he was going to be staying on the property, and sleeping on the workshop couch wasn't sustainable. They swept out 20 years of dust and debris, wiped down every surface, tested the faucets. The water had been shut off at the main. But Curtis knew where the shutoff valve was and got it going again. The plumbing groaned and coughed and then ran. The overhead lights didn't work, but there were functional outlet sockets, and Curtis had thought to bring an extension cord and a work lamp. They ate sandwiches Curtis had brought from a diner in town sitting at the old counter, and for a while they didn't talk. The comfortable silence of men doing necessary things together. Then Curtis said without particular preamble, he talked about you all the time at the end, in the hospital. His voice was level, but something underneath it wasn't. The nurses thought Danny was his brother at first. It took 3 days before any of us corrected them. He stopped, started again. He wasn't angry at you. I want you to know that. Whatever resentment you thought he had, it wasn't there. He was sad sometimes, missed you, but he wasn't angry. Daniel looked at his sandwich. His jaw worked. I should have been there. Yes, Curtis said simply. No softening it, just yes. But you're here now. That counts for something. He picked up his coffee. He used to say, you know what he used to say? He used to say that the people who run the farthest are usually running from the things that matter the most. He meant you when he said it, but he also knew he wasn't off the hook for his part in why you ran. A pause. Earl wasn't perfect, Danny. He was a man who loved his family and expressed it badly for about 20 years. He knew it. He was sorry for it. He just didn't know how to reach across the distance by the time he understood it. Daniel said nothing for a long time. Then he said, I'm going to put this place back together. I know. Not just the physical stuff, the whole thing. Running station, working repair shop. I've got the mechanic skills. I've got the property. I've got people coming. He paused. And I've got to make sure Callahan can't take it. One thing at a time. Yeah. Daniel looked around the office, the old counter, the shelves, the calendar from 1998, the ghost of a business that had once been alive and breathing and full of his father's presence. But maybe not too slow. People like Callahan, the minute they see activity on this property, they're going to move. Curtis set his coffee down. His expression shifted into something more alert. Why do you say that? Because my father documented him driving past twice a day when the fight was hot. The man monitors his targets. He's been watching this property for 17 years, waiting to see if anyone shows up to contest his claim. Daniel looked at him. When I turned onto Whitmore Road yesterday morning, I might as well have fired a flare gun. The quiet in the office had an edge to it now. You think he already knows you're here, Curtis said. Not a question. I think a man like Callahan, with the kind of money and connections he's demonstrated, has someone watching this road. Whether that's a person or a camera or just a contact at the county assessor's office who flags activity on the parcel, I don't know. But I have to assume we're already on his radar. Curtis was silent. He looked older suddenly in the way that fear adds years. Then we need Navarro faster than Thursday, he said. I'll call her tonight and ask if there's anything she can file before Thursday that puts our intent on the official record. Something that makes it clear the property is actively contested and the owner is present. That's smart, Curtis said. Earl would have thought of that. Then quietly, actually Earl wouldn't have. He was never great at the strategic part. He was great at the stubborn part. A flicker of something that might have been a smile. You got the strategic part from somewhere else. Daniel didn't say from where. But he thought about 30 years of club politics of navigating brotherhood and loyalty and the complex human geography of an organization that survived as much through intelligence as through force. He'd learned things in that life that weren't supposed to transfer anywhere useful. Apparently they did. He called Rebecca Navarro at 8 o'clock that night. She answered, which told him something about her. Mr. Whitmore, she said, Curtis told me you'd be calling. I need to ask you something before Thursday, he said. Is there anything you can file in the next 48 hours that legally documents my presence on the property and my intent to contest the quiet title action? Something that creates a record. A pause. He could hear her thinking. There's a notice of contest I can file with the county recorder's office. It won't resolve anything that takes time, but it puts a flag on the title that any title search will pick up. It tells anyone looking at this property that there's an active opposed claim. She paused again. It also means Callahan's lawyers will know within about 24 hours of it being filed. Good, Daniel said. Most clients try to avoid being on Callahan's radar. I'm not most clients. She was quiet for a moment. Then no, I don't think you are. Another pause, professional and measuring. I can file it tomorrow morning. I'll need you to sign a retainer agreement electronically. I'll send it tonight. I'll sign it tonight. One more thing, Mr. Whitmore. Do you have any idea what Callahan wants this land for? What he's been planning to develop here? Daniel frowned. No, do you? I have a theory, Navarro said. There's a highway bypass project that's been in planning for about 8 years, a new corridor that would route commercial traffic around 3 towns and link up with the interstate about 12 miles from your property. The corridor as currently mapped runs directly through this section of Yavapai County. A beat. Properties along that corridor have been selling at 4 to 5 times their assessed value. A developer who'd already quietly acquired land along that route would stand to make an extraordinary amount of money when the bypass is finalized. Daniel stood very still. Callahan didn't want my father's land because of what it was, he said slowly. He wanted it because of what it was going to be worth. That's my theory. I'm still researching it. But if I'm right, and I believe I am, then the amount of money at stake here is significant enough to explain every decision Callahan made over the past 20 years. She paused. It's also significant enough to explain why he might become very aggressive very quickly now that he knows you're back. Daniel's mind was running fast. He thought about the journal, about a man who fought and never knew exactly what he was fighting for. Just that it mattered, just that surrendering was wrong. Earl Whitmore had held onto this land out of stubbornness and love and principle, and it turned out he'd been sitting on something worth fighting for in ways he'd never imagined. File the notice tomorrow morning, he said. I will. And Ms. Navarro, Rebecca. Rebecca, thank you for answering tonight. I answer my phone at night when cases matter, she said simply. I'll see you Thursday. He hung up. He looked at the journal on the counter. He thought about a man driving past this station twice a day, about a lawsuit filed and never pushed through, about 17 years of quiet, patient waiting by a man with money and no visible hurry. The patience of someone who believed the other party would eventually give up or disappear. Daniel picked up the journal and held it. Not this time, he said, to no one. To the room, to whatever remained of Earl Whitmore and the walls and the tools and the cracked concrete and the fading sign. Not this time, Dad. He didn't sleep much that second night either. But when the sun started coming up through the boarded windows, casting thin lines of early light across the floor, he was already up and working, taking an inventory of everything the workshop needed, moving methodically through the list item by item, building the thing from the ground up the same way his father had built it the first time, from nothing, one piece at a time. At 7 in the morning, a truck pulled into the lot. It wasn't Curtis this time. It was a black SUV with a private plate moving slowly, pulling up to the edge of the lot and stopping. The window came down and Daniel could see a man inside somewhere in his 60s, well-dressed, silver-haired, looking at the property with an expression that mixed calculation and irritation in roughly equal measure. He sat there for a full minute without getting out of the vehicle. Daniel walked out of the workshop and stood in the middle of the lot and looked directly at the SUV. They looked at each other across the broken concrete. Then the window went back up and the SUV reversed and drove away. Daniel watched it until it was out of sight. He felt his pulse in his hands. He felt something hard and clear settle into place in his chest. He pulled out his phone and called Curtis. You know what Richard Callahan looks like? He asked when the line connected. I've seen photos. Why? Because I think he just drove by. A pause. And I want you to know I stood right there in the middle of that lot and I did not move. Curtis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, good. He's going to come back. I know. Let him come. Daniel looked at the old sign above the entrance. Whitmore Fuel and Repair. The letters barely visible through decades of weather and neglect. This is Whitmore land. It was before. It still is. And I'm here now. He paused. Tell Tom and LaGuardia I'll meet him this morning. I'm done taking stock. It's time to start moving. Tom LaGuardia drove a work truck that had seen 30 years of hard use and didn't apologize for any of it. He was a compact, dark-eyed man in his early 60s with the kind of hands that had been doing physical work since childhood and the kind of face that had stopped wasting energy on expressions that didn't mean something. He pulled into the Whitmore lot at 9 in the morning, stepped out of the truck, looked around the property with a single slow sweep, and then looked at Daniel. You're Earl's son, he said. Yeah, you look like him, around the eyes. He extended his hand. Tom LaGuardia. I've been waiting about 6 years for someone to show up here. They shook. Daniel measured the man the way he'd learned to measure people over 30 years, not by what they said, but by how they stood, how they met your eyes, what their handshake communicated about how they understood themselves in relation to the world. Tom LaGuardia's handshake said he'd been beaten down and hadn't let it make him small. Come inside, Daniel said. Tom brought a box. That was the first thing Daniel noticed when they got into the office. The man had brought an actual cardboard box, the kind that held reams of paper, and he set it on the counter with the care of someone setting down something irreplaceable. He lifted the lid, and Daniel could see it was full of folders, organized, labeled, tabbed with colored markers. 10 years, Tom said, looking at the box. Every letter, every notice, every phone call I documented, every conversation I had with my bank manager, my insurance agent, the county code enforcement office. He looked up at Daniel. Do you know what systematic means? When somebody with money decides they want what you have, I'm starting to understand it. It doesn't come at you like a wave. It comes at you like water finding cracks. One thing at a time, one problem at a time. Each one small enough that you think maybe it's just bad luck. Maybe it's just life. Tom's voice was flat, controlled, the way someone talks when they've had years to process a rage that didn't have anywhere useful to go. My insurance premium went up 40% in 1 year. Then my supplier changed payment terms on me, net 15 instead of net 30s. No explanation. Then a routine county inspection flagged 3 violations that the inspector had passed on for 20 years without a word. He paused. None of it was illegal. None of it was provably connected. But I've been doing business in this county for 30 years. I know what normal looks like, and none of it was normal. Daniel looked at the box. Navarro knows about your case. She represented me for 18 months. We couldn't prove the connection to Callahan directly, not enough for a lawsuit we could win. But we got close. Close enough that Callahan's lawyers sent a letter requesting we cease referring to their client in any communications related to the case. Tom smiled, and it wasn't a warm smile. When a man sends his lawyers to tell you to stop saying his name, you know you're getting somewhere. She thinks if my case and yours are connected, if your case and mine are connected, and if we can document Callahan's interest in the highway bypass corridor, we stop being 2 random property disputes and start being evidence of a coordinated campaign to acquire land through improper interference. Tom looked at him steadily. That's a different conversation. Legally, financially, and in terms of what it does to Callahan's reputation in this county. He paused. He's been trying to get a variance approved for a commercial development project in Prescott for 2 years. Any suggestion of a pattern of misconduct makes that variance a lot harder to get. Daniel nodded slowly. He was thinking fast. What do you need from me? Your father's journal, specifically the entries documenting Callahan's contact in the subsequent insurance and banking interference. Navarro will need them, but so will I. I want to cross-reference the dates against my own timeline. See if there's a pattern in how he moved between targets. Tom tapped the box. I think he's been working this corridor in sequence, moving from property to property. Your father held out longer than anybody. When he died and the property sat empty, Callahan moved on to the next target, but he never closed his file on Whitmore land, because he's never closed any file until he wins. Something about that landed in Daniel's chest like a stone. The image of a man with folders and patience and a very long memory working his way through a list. Earl Whitmore had been on that list for 20 years. He's going to move quickly now, Daniel said. Yes. Navarro's filing a notice of contest today. Tom's eyebrows went up slightly. Today, he stopped. That's aggressive. Good. I want him to know I'm not my father. He paused, then caught himself. I mean, my father didn't back down either, but he fought alone and he fought defensively. I want Callahan to understand from the first move that this is different. Tom looked at him for a moment with that measured, dark-eyed gaze. You know, your father came to see me once, about 3 months before he died. He came to the feed store we'd met through a county small business association years earlier. He sat across from me at my desk and he said, Tom, I think this Callahan business is bigger than just my piece of road. Tom's voice had shifted slightly, gone quieter. I told him I thought so too. We talked about getting a lawyer, combining what we knew, but he was already sick by then and He stopped. I was scared. I had a daughter in college. I didn't want the exposure. He looked at the box. I've spent a lot of years regretting that conversation. The room was quiet. You're here now, Daniel said. I am. Tom straightened. And so are you. They spent 2 hours going through Tom's files together. Daniel read while Tom narrated, and the picture that emerged was methodical and damning, and in its way impressive, in a fashion that made Daniel deeply angry. Callahan's operation, whatever constellation of LLCs and holding companies it worked through, had touched at least 7 properties along the corridor over a 15-year period. 5 of those properties had eventually sold to entities that title research traced through several layers of corporate structure back to Callahan's primary holding company. 2 had not Tom's property and the Whitmore land. Tom had lost his business anyway, driven out by financial pressure, but had retained enough of a legal fight to prevent a clean transfer. Earl Whitmore had simply refused to break. He's got 5 out of 7, Daniel said, and he's been waiting on the other 2. How much land are we talking about total along the corridor? Tom pulled a folded county map from the box. He'd marked it in red pen, indicating the properties. Daniel looked at it and did rough mental math. If the bypass goes through as mapped, Tom said, the commercial frontage value of that corridor increases by approximately 600% at full build-out. Conservative estimate based on comparable corridors in other Arizona counties. Daniel stared at the map. He's been assembling a land portfolio, Daniel said. Years of patient accumulation. A few $100,000 here, a manufactured problem there, and when the bypass is finalized, he sells everything, or develops it himself. Either way, we're talking about a return on investment that makes whatever he spent on lawyers and interference look trivial. Tom folded the map carefully. This is why he doesn't go away. This is why the quiet title action has been sitting open for 17 years. Because the potential payoff justifies the patience. Daniel sat back. He understood this now with a completeness he hadn't had before. This wasn't personal for Callahan. It never had been. Earl Whitmore had been an obstacle on a spreadsheet, and when Earl died, the spreadsheet entry just moved to the pending column. Daniel's arrival changed the calculation, but it didn't change Callahan's fundamental objective, which meant Daniel needed to make himself a different kind of problem. Not just a complication, a threat. I need to talk to Navarro about the bypass angle, he said. If we can tie his land acquisition to the bypass corridor in court documents, we change the scope of the case. Agreed, Bidon. But there's something else. Tom pulled another folder from the box. I found something 3 months ago that I haven't told Navarro yet because I wanted to understand it fully before I showed anyone. He set the folder on the counter. Open it. Daniel opened it. Inside were printouts of County Planning Commission, minutes, dry, dense government documents, the kind most people never read. Tom had highlighted several passages in yellow. Planning Commission meeting March of this year, Tom said. Agenda Item 7, a preliminary review of right-of-way acquisition for the bypass corridor. He pointed to a highlighted section. The county commissioner who brought the item forward is a man named Gerald Moss. He's been on the Planning Commission for 11 years. Another highlighted section. Cross-reference that name with this. He pulled a second document from the folder, a corporate filing from 2019. Daniel scanned it and felt something cold move through him. Gerald Moss was listed as a member of the board of a real estate investment trust called Sonoran Corridor Holdings, LLC. He looked up at Tom. Callahan is listed as the managing member of Sonoran Corridor Holdings, Tom said. I found it 3 weeks ago. It took me 6 months of cross-referencing corporate filings to get there, but it's documented and it's public record. He paused, and there was something in his voice now, something that had been waiting a long time for an audience. The county commissioner who is pushing the bypass corridor approval has a direct financial interest in the outcome. He stands to profit personally from the same land acquisitions he's helping to approve. Daniel set the document down very slowly. That's not just a property dispute, he said. No, Tom said. It's not. That's corruption. That's corruption, Tom confirmed, and it changes everything. Daniel picked up his phone. He dialed Rebecca Navarro. She answered on the second ring. I filed the notice 40 minutes ago, she said before he could speak. Callahan's title company will have notification by end of business today. Good. Rebecca, I need you to come to the property tonight instead of Thursday. Something's come up. He looked at Tom. Tom LaGuardia is here with me, and he's got something you need to see. Something big. A pause. How big? Planning Commission big. The silence on the other end was brief but significant. I'll be there by 6. She was there by 5:30. Rebecca Navarro was younger than Daniel had expected, late 30s, maybe 40, with the compact, efficient energy of someone who moved through life like she was always slightly behind schedule and had made peace with that. She was sharp-eyed and quick, and she asked questions the way a surgeon uses instruments, precisely purposefully, without wasted motion. She shook hands with both men, sat down at the old counter, and pulled out a legal pad. She went through Tom's documents in 40 minutes flat. She asked 12 questions. She didn't express emotion, but Daniel watched her face carefully, and when she reached the Sonoran corridor, Holdings filing, and saw Gerald Moss's name, something moved behind her eyes that he recognized as controlled excitement. She set the document down. She looked at Tom. How did you find this corporate filing cross-referencing? It took time. Does anyone else know about this connection? Not that I'm aware of. She looked at Daniel. Your father's journal, the documentation of the insurance and banking interference, the dates, the specific incidents, that's physical evidence of a pattern. Tom's files established the scope of that pattern across multiple properties. And this, she tapped the Sonoran Corridor Holdings document. This establishes a potential motive that goes all the way to the County Planning Commission. She paused. If we can document it that the bypass approval process is being influenced by a commissioner with a direct financial stake in the outcome, we're not just talking about property law. We're talking about the kind of case that goes beyond county court. What do you mean beyond county court? Daniel asked. I mean a formal complaint to the Arizona Attorney General's office. Potentially federal if there are federal funds involved in the bypass project. She looked at her legal pad. I need to know, are you prepared for this to get significantly larger than a property dispute? Daniel looked at her. I'm prepared to finish what my father started. That's not quite the same question I asked. Yes, he said, I'm prepared. She nodded once, made a note, and moved on. Roy Duckett arrived Friday morning in a van that was loaded with enough tools to outfit a small shop. His brother Marcus came with him, a quiet, deliberate man who spent the first 30 minutes walking every inch of the electrical system with a flashlight and a tester before he said a single word about what he found. What he found was mostly good news. The wiring was old, but sound, and the panel needed updating, but wasn't dangerous. He could have it up to code in 2 days. 2 days, Daniel said, if I work straight through. Marcus looked at him, which I plan to. Roy was already in the workshop by the time Marcus finished his assessment, taking the air compressor apart with the cheerful focus of someone who genuinely enjoyed the problem. Bearings are shot, he announced. Seals are gone, but the motor's solid. I can rebuild this by tomorrow. What do you need of parts? Give me a list in a hardware store in 20 miles. Pete Sobieski arrived Monday and went directly to the fuel pump situation. He stood at the old pumps with his arms crossed and his head tilted for about 4 minutes, saying nothing. And then he turned to Daniel and said, the tanks need a pressure test before anything else. You got an environmental testing company lined up. Curtis is working on it. Get it done first. Everything else is secondary to knowing what's in the ground. He looked at the pumps. These units are done. You're looking at replacement. But that's not the hard part. The hard part is permits. Environmental clearance, fuel handling, certification, new pump installation, permit. County's going to want all 3 before you can pump a gallon legally. Diane's handling permits, Daniel said. Pete looked at him. You've got this organized. I'm working on it. Your father wasn't organized, Pete said, not unkindly. He'd met Earl once years ago through Curtis. Earl was brilliant with engines and terrible with paperwork. I know. You're different. I had 30 years of a different kind of education. Pete nodded and went back to examining the pumps, and that was the end of that conversation. Diane Croswell arrived Thursday evening, 40 minutes after Navarro's meeting, wrapped up with a laptop bag and a clipboard and the organized, brisk competence of someone who had been managing impossible logistics since before most people in the room learned to drive. She introduced herself to Tom with the efficiency of a woman who didn't waste time on preliminaries, sat down with the county permit records Navarro had pulled, and had a complete breakdown of what was outstanding, what needed to be filed fresh, and what was salvageable from Earl's original permits within 3 hours. The operating license lapsed in 2002, she said. That needs to be refiled from scratch. The building permit for the repair shop is still technically on record. It was never closed out, which actually helps you. It means the structure was permitted. The fuel handling permit is county issued and will require the environmental clearance Pete mentioned before they'll touch it. She looked at her clipboard. Realistically, if everything moves without hitches, you're looking at 6 to 8 weeks for full operational permits. What could create hitches? Daniel asked. Diane looked at him over her clipboard with the expression of someone who had been dealing with county permit offices for 20 years. Code enforcement complaints, inspections that get delayed, applications that go to the bottom of the pile. She paused. Any of which could be influenced externally by someone with relationships at the county level. Callahan, the name didn't need to be said. So we need to move fast on everything simultaneously, Daniel said. Yes, and you need someone monitoring the permit applications daily to make sure nothing gets lost. She used air quotes on lost, which I can do remotely, but I need someone physically at the county office who can show up in person if something goes sideways. Curtis raised his hand from the corner of the room. I've got time. Diane looked at him. You know the county offices? I've lived in this county for 40 years. You know people there. I went to high school with the deputy assessor. A pause. We're not close, but she knows who I am. Diane nodded. Good. Human relationships still work in county offices. Use it. They were 7 people in a busted gas station office that night, and the energy in the room was something Daniel hadn't felt in a very long time. It had the specific quality of purposeful collective effort, not chaos, not confusion, but multiple intelligent people working toward the same objective from different angles, each one contributing something the others didn't have. It felt like planning a run, except the stakes were different. The stakes were real in a way that had weight. He looked around the room at one point and thought his father had fought this alone, had faced Callahan's full institutional machinery with nothing but stubbornness and a mechanic's hands and a journal nobody was reading. Daniel had people. The first shot came on Tuesday. He was in the workshop with Roy when Curtis called. His voice was tight in a way Daniel had learned in 2 weeks to take seriously. Code enforcement was here, Curtis said, about an hour ago while you were in the shop. Daniel straightened. And issued a notice of violation. They're citing the fuel tanks as an environmental hazard and the electrical system as a safety risk. Both violations carry a stop work order. Technically, you can't continue the renovation until both are resolved. The fuel tanks are being assessed. Pete has an environmental company coming Friday. I told them that. They said the assessment needs to be from a county-certified assessor, not just any environmental company. They left a list of approved assessors. Curtis paused. There are 4 companies on the web. I looked them up. 2 of them have Sonoran Corridor Holdings as a past client. The silence on the line was the kind that has a temperature to it. He got there before us, Daniel said. It looks that way. When's the stop work order effective? 48 hours. Daniel stood very still. His jaw was tight and his mind was running at full speed. 48 hours. Not enough time to get an environmental assessment done by any competent company, let alone navigate the county approval process, which was exactly the point. The stop work order wasn't meant to be complied with. It was meant to create uncertainty, legal risk, a chilling effect. It was meant to make Daniel and his crew stop moving and start worrying. He thought about his father, about water finding cracks, about a man alone fighting problem after problem, each one small enough to seem like bad luck. Curtis, he said, call Navarro right now. Tell her about the approved assessor list and the 2 Callahan-connected companies on it. That's a documented conflict of interest in a county enforcement action against a party currently in litigation with a Callahan entity. That is something she can use. On it. And call the other 2 companies on the approved list. Get them on the phone today. Find out their earliest availability and book the first one that can come before the stop work order is effective. Both at once. Both at once. Whoever can get here first, that's our guy. He paused. And Curtis, don't mention Callahan's name to either company. Just book the assessment. The cleaner our record is, the better. Curtis hung up, and Daniel stood in the workshop and breathed carefully. Roy had stopped working and was watching him. Trouble, Roy said. Manage trouble, Daniel said. Go back to work. Roy went back to work. Navarro called back in 20 minutes. Her voice had the same controlled excitement it had carried in the meeting the week before, except sharper now. The approved assessor list is published by the County Environmental Health Division. I checked the division's vendor approval process. There's supposed to be a competitive review and a conflict of interest declaration from each listed vendor. I'm filing a public records request in the next hour for those declarations. She paused. If either of those Callahan-connected companies failed to disclose the relationship in their vendor application, that's a procedural violation that could invalidate the entire approved list. Which means the stop work order citing that list, Daniel said, could be challenged on the grounds that it was issued under a procedurally deficient enforcement mechanism. She was almost crisp about it. I'm also filing an emergency motion with the county court today citing the stop work order as a pattern of interference with the pending quiet title proceeding. We're arguing that any county enforcement action against the property during active litigation should be stayed pending resolution. Can we get that in 48 hours? I can get it in 24 if the judge takes the motion seriously, which I believe he will because I'm going to attach the Sonoran Corridor Holdings document and make very clear to the court that this stop work order appears to be connected to a financial interest that runs all the way to the County Planning Commission. A pause. If I'm right, and I think I am, this is going to get the attention of people above the county level very quickly. Is that good or bad for us? Short term, it creates noise. Long term, it creates accountability. She stopped. Daniel, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to do, filing this motion, attaching that document, putting Gerald Moss's name on a legal filing, crosses a line. Once I do this, there is no quiet resolution. Callahan will know we have the Moss connection. He will know we intend to use it. Things may move very fast after that, and not all of them will be comfortable. Daniel thought about the black SUV driving slowly past the lot. He thought about a man watching a property for 17 years patient and certain believing the silence would last forever. File it, Daniel said. She filed it. By the following morning, the motion was in the court system. By noon, Navarro had confirmation that the emergency stay request had been assigned to a judge and would be reviewed within 24 hours. By 3 in the afternoon, something happened that none of them had anticipated. Tom LaGuardia called Daniel, and his voice was different, tighter, more careful. I just got a call, he said, from a man who said he was calling on behalf of Richard Callahan. Daniel stepped out of the workshop. What did he say? He said Callahan wanted to offer me a settlement, full resolution of my feed store litigation, a cash payment. A pause. Daniel, it was a significant number. The air felt very still. How significant? Tom told him. Daniel was quiet for a moment. When do you need to give them an answer? They want an answer by Friday. They said the offer expires Friday at 5 o'clock. Tom paused. Daniel, I have medical bills. I've been fighting this for 10 years. I'm 63 years old, and I'm tired in ways I can't fully explain to you in this money. He stopped. I'm not saying I'm going to take it. I'm saying I need you to understand what it means that they're offering it now. It means they're scared, Daniel said. Yes. They know about the Moss filing. They know we have the connection, and they want to buy you out before this gets bigger. He gripped the phone. Tom, if you take that money, they make LaGuardia go away. They still have to deal with me and the Moss document, but they lose your documentation of the pattern. They lose 10 years of your files, and they put a gag clause in that settlement because they always do. I know, but I can't tell you what to do. I can't look at your medical bills and your 10 years of fighting and tell you that you owe my situation anything. He meant it. He felt the weight of meaning it. What do you want to do? Tom was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that has history in it. My father built that feed store, Tom said finally. Same year your father built this gas station near enough. Same kind of man near enough. Worked his whole life, left it to me. Another pause. I sold the equipment. I sold the inventory. I gave up the building. I've spent 10 years telling myself that at least I kept fighting, that at least I didn't let them just take it without a fight. His voice had steadied into something resolute. If I take this money and sign their paper and go quiet, then what was the fight for? What were the 10 years for? Daniel didn't say anything. I'm not taking it, Tom said. But I need you to know it cost me something to say that. I know it did. Don't waste it. I won't, Daniel said. I promise you I won't. He hung up and stood in the lot looking at the station. 7 people had given time they didn't have. Curtis had spent 8 years paying taxes on someone else's property. Tom had just turned down life-changing money. Rebecca Navarro was fighting a case that was growing in ways that could affect her professional reputation and her safety. And Daniel was standing in his father's lot with grease on his hands and $800 that was long gone by now. And he understood with absolute clarity that this had passed the point of being his personal fight a long time ago. It was something larger now. He walked back into the workshop, picked up a wrench, and went back to work. That evening, Roy pulled him aside. They were the last two left on the property. The others had gone back to their motel down the road, and Curtis had driven home to let his dog out and sleep in his own bed for the first time in a week. Roy was washing his hands at the utility sink, and he looked at Daniel in the mirror above it. "I've been watching you," Roy said, "since I got here." "Okay." "You're carrying all of it," Roy said. "The legal stuff, the permit stuff, the money stuff, Tom's situation, Curtis. You're carrying every piece of it. Somebody has to. Your father carried everything alone, and it killed him." Roy turned from the sink and dried his hands and looked at Daniel directly. Not with sentiment, Roy Duckett didn't do sentiment, but with the kind of honesty that only comes from long-tested friendship. "You've got people, Danny, real people who showed up because they wanted to. Let them carry some of it." Daniel leaned against the workbench. He was tired in a way that went below physical tired, the way you get when every day brings a new problem that requires full mental engagement and you haven't had a genuinely quiet moment in 2 weeks. "I hear you," he said. "Do you?" "Yeah." He looked at the workshop, the rebuilt compressor, the cleaned lift, the organized tool wall, the evidence of 7 people's labor, turning a dead space back into something real. "Yeah, Roy, I do." He paused. "Thank you for coming." Roy shrugged the way men shrug when gratitude makes them uncomfortable. "Wasn't a question," he said. "You called. We came." He picked up his jacket. "That's what it's supposed to mean." He left. Daniel stayed. He sat on his father's workbench in the empty shop and looked at everything that had been built in 2 weeks from nothing. And he thought about Roy's words, and he thought about Tom turning down the settlement, and he thought about the motions sitting in the county court waiting for a judge's eyes in the morning. He thought about what his father had written in the journal. The last entry, "Don't let the bastards win." He reached into his pocket and took out the key, the one from the lockbox, the one Earl had left with 4 lines of careful handwriting and a lifetime of things he hadn't said. Daniel had been carrying it every day since he found it. He turned it over in his hand. Old metal, worn smooth. "I hear you, Dad," he said to the empty shop. "I'm not going anywhere." He put the key back in his pocket and got up and went back to work. The judge reviewed Navarro's emergency motion in 18 hours. Daniel was in the workshop with Marcus checking the newly updated electrical panel when Navarro called. He picked up on the first ring. "The stay was granted," she said, "effective immediately. All county enforcement actions against the property are suspended pending resolution of the quiet title proceeding." Daniel put one hand flat on the workbench and breathed. "How long does the stay hold?" "Until the quiet title case is resolved or the court determines otherwise. Minimum several months. More likely longer." She paused. The judge also issued a note in his order, a judicial note which is rare, observing that the timing of the stop work order relative to the pending litigation raised questions that the court found, quote, "difficult to explain by coincidence alone." She stopped. "Daniel, a federal judge, doesn't write that kind of language unless he's sending a message. He's telling Callahan he's watching. He's telling everyone he's watching." Another pause, and this one had weight to it. "My phone rang 20 minutes ago. Callahan's lead attorney, a man named Hargrove. I've dealt with him before. He's expensive and he's careful and he does not make phone calls unless his client has authorized them." She let that sit for a second. "He said his client was open to a conversation about resolving the quiet title matter outside of court." Daniel straightened. "He wants to settle." He floated the word conversation, not settlement, not offer, conversation. Her voice was measured. "Which means he doesn't want to show his hand yet, but he wanted me to know the door is open. Because of the Moss filing. Without question, the moment we put Gerald Moss's name on a court document with the Sonoran Corridor Holdings connection attached, the exposure changed. Callahan isn't afraid of a property dispute. He's fought dozens of those. He is very much afraid of a corruption allegation that puts a county planning commissioner's name in the same sentence as his." She paused. "That's a different kind of problem. That's the kind of problem that follows a man." Daniel thought fast. His instinct, the instinct from 30 years of negotiations that happened in back rooms and parking lots and diners at 2 in the morning, said, don't move. Not yet. Don't let them know what you have and what you're willing to do with it, because the moment you open a negotiation, you give away information. You reveal your floor. And right now, Callahan didn't know exactly how much they had or exactly how far they were prepared to take it. Tell Hargrove we'll consider a conversation, Daniel said, but we're not initiating it. If his client wants to talk, his client can request a meeting formally, through you, in writing. That forces them to come to us. And it creates a record that they sought us out. He paused. Can you get me a timeline on the Attorney General referral? If we're going to use the Moss connection as leverage, I want to know exactly where we stand with that before we sit down with Callahan's people. I filed the preliminary inquiry yesterday, Navarro said. The AG's office typically acknowledges receipt within 2 weeks. But I have a contact there. I'll make a call. She paused. Daniel, I want to make sure you understand what the AG referral does. It takes the Moss issue out of our hands. The moment they open an investigation, we don't control that process anymore. I know. Is that what you want? Because right now, the Moss document is leverage. Once it's in the AG's hands, it becomes a different thing. It becomes a government investigation. Callahan's lawyers will lawyer up harder. Moss will retain his own counsel. It gets complicated and it gets loud. Rebecca, Daniel said, do you know what my father wrote in his journal about why he wouldn't sell? Tell me. He didn't write about money. He didn't write about principle exactly. He wrote, Daniel had the passage memorized by now, had turned it over in his mind so many times the words had the texture of something he'd known all his life. If I let Callahan have this land, the next man he goes after won't have anything to fight back with. I'm not just holding this for Danny. I'm holding it so there's still something left to hold. He paused. My father didn't have the AG referral option. He didn't have a lawyer like you. He fought with what he had, and he still almost won. He let that sit. I've got more than he had. I'm not going to use it halfway. The silence on the line was the kind that means someone is absorbing something. I'll move the AG referral forward, Navarro said quietly. Thank you. He hung up. Marcus was looking at him from across the workshop, having heard enough to understand the shape, if not the details. He raised his eyebrows. Good news or complicated news? Marcus asked. Both, Daniel said. Go back to work. Word moves in small communities, the way water moves through sand, quietly, pervasively in ways you don't notice until it's everywhere. Whitmore Road was 22 miles from the nearest town, but people had been watching the activity at the old station with the particular attention that rural communities pay to things that change. Trucks coming and going, lights on where there had been no lights in 20 years. The sound of tools and compressors and voices in a place that had been silent since the Clinton administration. The first person to stop was a woman in her early 70s named Mae Sutton, who drove a pickup truck with 300,000 miles on it and pulled up to the lot on a Wednesday morning without warning and climbed out and looked at Daniel with the direct, unhurried assessment of someone who had lived on the land long enough to have earned the right to look at people that way. You Earl's boy, she said. Yes, ma'am. She looked him over. You look like him. Less patient, maybe. She said it like it was a neutral observation. I live 8 miles east, had my truck serviced here for 15 years up until Earl closed up. She glanced at the property. Heard you were rebuilding. Working on it. When you open, he hadn't said anything to anyone about opening. The word surprised him slightly. Working toward that, he said. Few more weeks on the physical side, permits after that. She nodded once, the kind of nod that doesn't require elaboration. My alternator's been making a noise for 6 weeks. The dealership in Prescott wants $400 to look at it. She looked at him. You fix alternators? He almost smiled. I fix alternators. Good, I'll be back. She climbed back into her truck and drove away. Pete was standing in the workshop doorway and had heard the whole exchange. First customer, he said. She hasn't paid anything yet. She'll be back. You heard her. Woman like that says she'll be back. She'll be back. He went back inside. A moment later, from inside the workshop, your dad had regulars like that. All small business people do when they're doing it right. People who come back because the work is honest and the price is fair. A pause. Word travels from them. Always does. 3 more people stopped that week. A man in his 60s who'd heard about the rebuild from Curtis and wanted to know if Daniel did transmission work. A younger woman, late 30s, a rancher whose diesel truck needed injector service, and who'd been driving 40 miles to a shop she didn't fully trust. A retired county road worker named Bill, who didn't have a vehicle problem at all, just wanted to shake Daniel's hand because he'd known Earl and thought it was right that someone came back. Bill stayed for 2 hours. He sat on the stool behind the counter and talked about Earl Whitmore the way people talk about someone who mattered to them, not in eulogies, not in polished memories, but in specific unedited recollections that had the texture of real life. Earl fixing Bill's truck on credit during a hard winter and refusing to be repaid until spring. Earl staying late on a Saturday to replace a water pump on a woman's car so she could make it to her daughter's wedding in Tucson on Sunday morning. Earl keeping a list, an actual handwritten list of customers who were going through difficult times so he could give them a break on labor without making it a thing they had to ask for. Daniel listened to all of it. He hadn't known any of it. He'd grown up in this station and he'd been so wrapped up in his own grievance, the absent father, the business that came before everything, that he hadn't seen what his father was actually doing. Earl Whitmore hadn't been choosing the station over his family. He'd been doing exactly what he wrote in the journal, building something. And not just for Daniel, for the road, for the community, for the particular web of small connections that makes a place feel like a place instead of just a location. That understanding hit Daniel differently than reading it in the journal had. Reading it was information. Hearing Bill Kramer talk about Earl at the end of a long day's work, voice roughened by age and genuine feeling that was something else. That became real in a different register. When Bill finally left, Daniel sat behind the counter for a while in the quiet and thought about the man he'd decided his father was at 19 years old, and the man his father had apparently actually been, and the gap between those two men and what 30 years of running from the wrong image had cost him. Then he picked up a wrench and got back to work because that was the only honest response. The call from Callahan's lawyer came on a Thursday. Not to Navarro, directly to Daniel's cell phone. That was the first thing wrong with it. Hargrove, the same name Navarro had mentioned, the expensive, careful one, called Daniel's personal number, which meant Callahan had resources capable of finding it, which was not particularly surprising, but was worth noting. Daniel answered. "Mr. Whitmore." The voice was smooth, professionally modulated, the voice of a man who had been making difficult calls sound reasonable for 30 years. "My name is Edward Hargrove. I represent Richard Callahan. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "You're catching me at the only time I have," Daniel said. "What do you want?" A brief pause, almost imperceptible, that acknowledged the lack of social lubrication without commenting on it. "My client asked me to reach out personally to express his respect for what you're doing with your father's property. Truly, he has no desire for conflict with the Whitmore family." Daniel said nothing. "He asked me to convey that the quiet title matter can be resolved very simply, and to his mind should have been resolved years ago. He feels the legal ambiguity has been unfair to your family." Another smooth pause. "He's prepared to formally withdraw the quiet title action and release any claim his companies may have on the property, with no conditions." Daniel stood very still. He'd expected an offer. He hadn't expected that offer. "No conditions," he said. "None. Clear title to you recorded with the county, the quiet title action dismissed with prejudice. You get your property free and clear." He thought fast. The offer was real, or at least the shell of it was real, but nothing Callahan had done in 20 years had been without conditions, even when the conditions weren't stated. A man who had spent 2 decades maneuvering through corporate structures and manufactured legal problems didn't suddenly become generous. "What does he want in return?" Daniel asked. "As I said, there are no conditions." "What does he want?" Daniel said again. And he said it the way you say something to someone when you want them to understand that you know they're lying without requiring them to admit it out loud. A longer pause this time. "My client would appreciate a mutual agreement to resolve all matters between the parties privately and without further legal proceedings." There it was. "He wants me to drop the AG referral," Daniel said. The silence on the line was confirmation enough. "He wants me to drop the referral," Daniel said again. "He gives me clean title, and in exchange, Gerald Moss's name stays out of the Attorney General's office." He let that sit for a moment. Tell your client that this conversation is being documented and that my attorney will be receiving a full account of it within the hour. He paused. And tell him the answer is no. He hung up. His hands were not entirely steady. He stood in the lot for a moment, breathing deliberately, feeling the adrenaline metabolize through his system. Then he called Navarro. Hargrove just called me directly, he said when she picked up, on my personal cell. He heard the quality of her silence shift. That's a violation of professional conduct. An attorney cannot contact a represented party directly. He knows that. They know that. A pause. They're rattled. Tell me everything, he said. He told it everything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The offer to withdraw the quiet title action with no conditions is actually significant, she said. That's real. They don't want this in court anymore. Her voice was measured, thoughtful. The request for the mutual release, that's them trying to close the box before the OIG opens it. Can they do that? Can they make the referral go away by settling? No, she said firmly. The referral is in the AG's hands. A private settlement between you and Callahan doesn't close a government investigation. At most, it removes you as a cooperating witness, but the AG can pursue this independently once they've opened a file. A pause, which Callahan's lawyers either don't understand or they're betting you don't understand. Or they're betting I'll take the clean title and go home. Yes. Daniel looked at the station. The sign above the entrance letters still faded, but now straighter. Roy had rehung it 2 days ago, leveled it properly, the first thing he'd done when he arrived. Whitmore Fuel and Repair. I'm not going home, he said. I am home. The week that followed was the hardest one yet, and it was hard in a way Daniel hadn't anticipated, not dramatic, not crisis-driven, but grinding. The permits were moving, but slowly caught in exactly the kind of bureaucratic friction that Diane had warned about. An application that should have taken 3 days to process sat untouched for 7. An inspection that was scheduled got rescheduled without explanation. Nothing dramatic enough to fight directly, just friction, just the steady application of small delays. Diane worked the phones from Phoenix. Curtis showed up at the county office in person 3 days in a row. The deputy assessor Curtis knew the woman from high school made some calls and got one application unstuck, though she was careful about how directly she was willing to engage. She's got retirement to think about, Curtis told Daniel. I can't ask her to go too far out on a limb. I know, what she did is enough. She told me something, though. Off the record. Curtis looked at him. Moss knows his name is in the filing. She didn't say how she knew that, but she said the planning commission meeting that was scheduled for next month, the bypass corridor item, has been pulled from the agenda. Daniel absorbed that. He's going quiet. For now. Pulling the item doesn't make the filing go away, but it slows the timeline down. Makes it harder to argue there's active harm. Curtis paused. Your lawyer's going to want to know this. She already does, Daniel said. Navarro had sources he wasn't fully aware of, which was exactly how it should be. The environmental assessment came back on the fuel tanks and the news was mixed. The tanks themselves were structurally sound, no leaks, no contamination of consequence. That was the good news. The bad news was that they were too old to be certified for continued use under current environmental code and would need replacement before the station could legally pump fuel. Tank replacement was the single most expensive item on the rebuild list. Pete put the estimate at between $40,000 and $60,000 for a compliant installation. Daniel sat with that number for 2 days. He didn't have $40,000. He didn't have $4,000. The crew was working for nothing for the value of the work and for the kind of solidarity that doesn't come with an invoice. But equipment and permits and materials cost what they cost, and the rebuild had been moving on a combination of what people brought with them, what Daniel could source cheaply, and what Curtis quietly covered when something was essential. He didn't want to ask Curtis for $40,000. Curtis didn't have $40,000, and a bank loan was theoretically possible, but the property still had the cloud of the quiet title action on it, even with the stay, which made it essentially unfinanceable through conventional channels. He sat in the workshop late on a Friday night, turning the problem over in his mind, and he was still sitting there at midnight when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. He answered. Daniel Whitmore. A woman's voice. Older. Steady. Who's calling? My name is Helen Park. I'm a journalist with the Arizona Republic. A pause. I've been following the property litigation in Yavapai County, including the filing that mentioned Commissioner Moss. I'd like to talk to you about your father's gas station. Daniel sat forward. How did you get this number? I'm a journalist. I find numbers. She said it without apology. I want to be straightforward with you. I've been working on a story about land acquisition practices along the proposed bypass corridor for 4 months. Your situation is the most well-documented example I've found. The journal, the quiet title action, the Moss connection. If you're willing to talk, this becomes a very different story than what I have. Daniel's mind ran the angles fast. Press coverage was a double-edged thing. It created accountability and public record and the kind of attention that made certain kinds of manipulation harder. It also created noise that could complicate legal proceedings and give Callahan's lawyers something to argue about. He thought about Tom, about the AG referral, about a man who had fought entirely in the dark for 4 years and died before anyone knew his story. What kind of story are you writing? He said. And the kind that runs on the front page, she said simply. The kind that makes planning commissioners nervous. I need to talk to my attorney before I talk to you. Of course. Give me your number. I'll call you back within 24 hours. She gave it to him. He wrote it down. He sat for another minute after she hung up holding his phone. Then he thought about something his father had written in the journal. One of the early entries from a time before Callahan, before the fight. A line about why he kept the station even when the money was bad and the hours were brutal and everything argued for quitting. People need to see that some things hold, Earl had written. In a world where everything gets bought and sold and torn down, they need to see that somebody stood their ground. Daniel looked at Helen Park's number on his notepad. He called Navarro. She answered on the second ring. It was almost 1 a.m, and listened without interrupting while he told her about the call. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Arizona Republic has a strong investigative desk, she said. If Park isn't working a 4-month story on the corridor, she knows things we don't know yet. And if she's ready to run, she stopped. Press coverage changes the terrain. It makes everything public. Callahan can't make quiet moves once his name is on the front page. Is that good for the legal case? It's complicated for the legal case and good for the overall outcome, she said. There's a difference. In court, we need clean evidence and proper procedure. In the real world, a front-page story creates pressure that courts can't. It makes the county commission uncomfortable. It makes the A's office move faster. It makes Callahan's other business relationships nervous. She paused. My advice is to talk to her. On the record, controlled. Nothing about specific evidence we haven't filed yet. Your story, your father's story, is fair game. Okay. Daniel, she paused. One more thing. The AG's office called me today. I was going to tell you in the morning. They've opened a preliminary inquiry into Commissioner Moss. It's not a full investigation yet, and it takes time to get there, but they've opened the file. Another pause. Things are moving, faster than I expected. He sat in the quiet workshop with that information settling into him. Things were moving. After 17 years of nothing moving, after his father spent 4 years pushing against something immovable, and then died and the stillness returned, and the land sat waiting, and Callahan waited with it patient as stone. Things were moving now. He thought about the morning he turned down Whitmore Road on no particular instinct, on nothing more than the faded sight of a name on a sign on some pole he couldn't have named if he'd tried. He thought about a cold morning at a diner counter and a waitress who said you just can't see it yet from where you're standing. He looked around the workshop, the rebuilt compressor humming, the electrical panel updated and certified, the tool wall organized by his father's original system, which Daniel had remembered from childhood, without realizing he'd remembered it until his hands automatically replicated it. The lift greased and tested, the workbench solid as the day Earl bolted it to the floor. In the corner framed and hung by Curtis 2 days ago without making a thing of it, a photograph, black and white printed from a scan of the original. A young Earl Whitmore in front of the station, probably 1972, squinting into the sun oil on his hands, grinning like a man who just built something worth grinning about. Daniel looked at the photograph for a moment. I'm going to call the journalist, he said aloud. To the room, to the photograph, to whoever might be listening in whatever way the dead listen. And I'm not settling, and I'm not stopping. He paused. And when this is done, this place is going to run the way you built it. Honest work. Fair price. Somebody standing their ground. He put his phone in his pocket, He turned off the work lamp. He lay down on the old workshop couch. He'd gotten a proper pillow and a blanket by this point, and he stared at the ceiling in the dark. Outside, somewhere down Whitmore Road, he heard a car pass slowly. Then it was gone. He knew what it was. He closed his eyes. Let them watch. Let them count the lights on and the trucks in the lot and run their calculations about whether this man was going to fold. Let Callahan sit in his office and recalculate and tell his lawyers to send more letters and wait for Daniel Whitmore to get tired and go back to wherever he came from. He wasn't going anywhere. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. He was home. The tank installation began on a Wednesday. Pete Sobieski had sourced the equipment through a supplier in Phoenix, 2 fiberglass double-wall tanks, fully compliant with current environmental code rated for gasoline and diesel, with the monitoring systems required by county environmental health. The delivery truck arrived at 7 in the morning, and Pete was already in the lot, coffee in hand, watching the driver back in with the professional satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Daniel stood beside him and watched the tanks come off the truck and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not excitement, not relief, something quieter and more specific than either of those things. The weight of a real thing becoming real. The particular gravity of a moment when the abstract, the plan, the fight, the long and grinding accumulation of legal victories and permit approvals in small daily battles becomes concrete and physical and undeniable. The tanks were going in the ground. The station was going to pump fuel again for the first time in 22 years. Curtis arrived an hour into the installation. He didn't say anything when he pulled up and got out of his truck and saw what was happening. He just stood beside Daniel in the lot and watched, and after a few minutes, he put his hand briefly on Daniel's shoulder, one solid wordless touch, and then took it away. 3 weeks, Pete said without turning around, speaking to nobody in particular, or maybe to both of them. 3 weeks from today, you'll be pumping. He paused. If the county inspector doesn't find a reason to slow it down. He won't, Diane said from behind them. She'd driven up from Phoenix the night before and was holding her clipboard, which had become something of a running joke among the crew. The clipboard that had shepherded 17 permits through a county system that had been at best indifferent and at worst actively hostile. Final inspection is scheduled. I confirmed it this morning. I also confirmed the inspector by name looked up his record and verified he has no documented business relationships with Sonoran Corridor Holdings or any related entity. She looked at Daniel. We're clean. You checked the inspector, Daniel said. Sure. I check everything, Diane said. That's why you called me. Roy came out of the workshop, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked at the tanks being maneuvered into position. Hell of a thing, he said. Yeah, Daniel agreed. Your dad would have had something to say about this. He'd have complained that fiberglass isn't as good as steel, Daniel said. And then he'd have checked every fitting himself 3 times before he trusted anyone else's work. Roy smiled. It was a real smile, the unguarded kind. Sounds about right. They stood there, all 5 of them, plus Marcus, who had emerged from the electrical panel he was certifying with a screwdriver still in his hand, and watched the tanks go into the ground in the lot where Earl Whitmore had built a business from scratch and where his son had come back to finish what was started. Nobody talked much. Some moments don't require words. They just require witnesses. Tom LaGuardia arrived that afternoon. He'd been calling regularly since the quiet title dismissal, brief calls, practical checking in on permit progress, and legal developments with the efficient communication of a man who had learned not to waste time. But this was the first time he'd come to the property since the early days, and something was different about him when he stepped out of his truck. Lighter. Not happy exactly, Tom LaGuardia was not a man who wore happiness openly, but carrying less. The way a person looks when a load they've been under for so long, they forgot what it felt like to stand straight, has been partially lifted. He shook Daniel's hand and looked at the excavation work in the lot and the tank installation and the crew moving around the property with the coordinated purposefulness that had developed over weeks of working together. You're actually going to open, he said, in about 3 weeks, maybe less. I wasn't sure you would, Tom said, not as criticism, as honest admission. When we started when you first called and we sat in this office and went through my files, I thought you had the fire for the fight, but I wasn't sure about the rest of it. The business part, the showing up every day part. What changed your mind? Tom looked at him. When you told me about Callahan calling you directly, personally, on a Saturday morning. He paused. A man like Callahan doesn't make personal calls unless he's out of moves. He was out of moves because you didn't play it the way he expected. He looked at the lot. You fought him on every front simultaneously, and you got people, and you went public, and you didn't take any of the exits he offered. Tom paused. He ran that play on 7 people before you. They all took an exit eventually. That's why he thought it worked. He looked at Daniel. You were the 8th. My father was the first. Tom was quiet for a moment. Your father held. He just couldn't finish it. He paused. You finished it. Daniel looked at the trucks and the crew and the tanks going into the ground. We finished it, he said. Tom stayed for dinner. Curtis had brought food, the kind of spread that happens naturally when people have been working together and somebody decides it's time to eat like humans, and they sat in the office and workshop plates on the workbench and the counter, and for a while they didn't talk about legal proceedings or permit timelines or Callahan or Moss or anything that had consumed the last 2 months. They talked like people who had been through something together and had come out the other side and were now for the first time able to breathe. Roy told stories from the road that made Marcus choke on his food. Pete gave his professional assessment of every mechanic he'd ever worked alongside, which was delivered with a specificity that suggested he had been composing this ranking for several decades. Diane described the permit office experience in such precise and devastating detail that Curtis, who had spent 3 weeks personally navigating it, had to put his food down because he was laughing too hard to eat. Daniel sat in the middle of it and let it wash over him. He was tired in a way that had changed quality recently, still deep, still bone level, but without the sharp edge of anxiety that had been running underneath everything for 2 months. The tiredness now was the kind that came from doing real work toward a real thing, and it felt honest in a way that very little had for a very long time. He looked around the room. 7 people who had come when he called, who had given weeks of their lives and their labor and their expertise for a project that wasn't theirs by any conventional measure of interest. He had been thinking for weeks about how to honor that, and he had not arrived at an answer that felt adequate because there wasn't one. You couldn't adequately thank people for the kind of thing these people had done. You could only try to make the thing they helped build worth the building. He stood up. The room got quiet the way rooms do when a person has something to say, and the people in the room understand that. I'm not good at this, he said. At the he stopped. He tried again. My father was good at doing things and not talking about them. I inherited that, mostly. He looked around the room. I need to say something that I probably should have said a week ago or a month ago, except I didn't know yet how to say it. He paused. You all gave me something I didn't know I needed, which was proof that showing up for somebody means something. That when a man calls and says he needs help with something that matters, people come. He stopped. I thought that was something I'd lost. From the years in the club, from the people I used to ride with who stopped answering from... He stopped again. He was not going to get emotional in front of Roy Duckett. Roy would never let him live it down. From a long time of telling myself that you can't count on anyone. He looked at his hands. You all proved me wrong, and I'm grateful for it. That's the whole of it. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Roy said, You done? Yeah. Good. Roy picked up his fork. Now sit down. You're making it weird. The laughter came fast and genuine, and Daniel sat down and picked up his plate, and that was the most complete expression of love any of them were capable of in that moment, and it was enough. The county inspector came on a Tuesday, 9 days later. His name was Carl Yates, and he was a man in his early 60s who had been doing this job long enough to have seen every kind of installation properly done, improperly done, and every variation between, and who moved through the property with the wordless efficiency of someone for whom assessment was a physical language he'd spent decades becoming fluent in. He checked the tanks, checked the monitoring systems, checked the fuel line connections, checked the canopy supports that Roy had rebuilt, checked the electrical work Marcus had certified, checked the pump foundations Pete had poured. He made notes. He did not comment as he went. This is the specific torment of inspection, the professional silence that reveals nothing. Daniel followed him at a respectful distance and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, and because the inspector didn't need conversation, he needed space to do his work. After 40 minutes, Yates closed his notebook and turned to face Daniel. "You did this yourself," he said. "Meaning the crew, meaning the rebuild. With help." Yates looked around. He looked at the reinstalled pump housings, the re-leveled canopy, the repainted lines on the lot surface, the repaired exterior of the building. "Your dad owned this place. Built it in 1971. Yates nodded once, a small motion that contained a complete thought. He'd been doing county inspections in Yavapai County for 22 years. He had probably driven past this exit 100 times when the station was dark. "It's good work," he said. He paused. "I'll process the certification today. You will have paperwork by end of week." Daniel kept his face neutral until Yates's truck pulled out of the lot. Then he turned toward the workshop where the crew was waiting and gave them a single nod. Roy pumped his fist once, silently. Marcus went back to his wiring. Pete nodded with the satisfaction of a man who had not doubted the outcome and was simply acknowledging that the inevitable had arrived on schedule. Diane immediately got on her phone to file the final operational permit application because there was always one more thing to file. Curtis came out of the office and stood beside Daniel and looked at the lot. "1 week," Daniel said. "1 week," Curtis agreed. "We're going to need a sign," Daniel said. "Not a new sign. I want to restore the old one, the one my father made." Curtis was quiet for a moment. "I know somebody who does woodwork, does it properly." A pause. "Earl would want the same lettering, same colors, same everything," Daniel said. "Exactly the same." Curtis nodded. He got on his phone and made the call right there in the lot. The sign took 4 days to restore. The craftsman Curtis knew, a man named Freddie Ochoa, who had been doing finished woodwork in the county for 30 years, came out, assessed the original sign's condition, and delivered his verdict with the particular bluntness of an artisan. "The wood's good. Earl used good wood. The lettering's faded, but the routing is still clean underneath. I can bring it back." He paused. "Red and black like it was." "Red and black," Daniel confirmed. "And the year, 1971. Freddie looked at him. "Not when you're reopening. The year my father built it," Daniel said. "That's the year that goes on the sign." The night before the opening, Daniel was alone in the station. The crew had gone back to their motels, their homes, their lives, or at least to the temporary accommodations they'd been inhabiting for weeks, with the cheerful inconvenience of people who had decided a thing was worth it. Curtis had gone home to sleep in his own bed for what would be, he'd noted, the first night in a week that he'd managed to do so without waking up at 3 a.m. thinking about county permit timelines. Daniel sat behind the counter of the office his father had built and looked at the space around him. The sign Freddie had restored was back above the entrance, hung level and true, the red and black lettering clean and bright against the restored wood. "Whitmore Fuel and Repair. Established 1971. It looked the way it had looked when Daniel was 7 years old, and his father held him up to see it the day it was first hung. Earl's calloused hands around his small rib cage. Earl's voice saying, "There it is. Danny, that's ours." He had forgotten that memory until this week. It had surfaced the day Freddie rehung the sign, arriving with the startling completeness of something that had never been lost, only buried the specific physical sensation of being lifted, the specific sound of his father's voice saying those 3 words, the specific quality of the pride in them. Not boasting, just the quiet, grounded certainty of a man showing his son something that belonged to both of them. He sat with that memory for a while. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out the journal. He'd been keeping it in the office in a new metal box, locked, properly sealed against moisture and heat, the kind that would survive decades rather than just years. He'd been reading from it occasionally in the evenings after the crew left, not mining it for information or legal ammunition, but just reading it the way you read a letter from someone you loved and lost, the way you return to a conversation that ended before it was finished. He opened it to the last entry, March 2nd, 2007. The handwriting slightly unsteady, his father's eyesight already going, the letters larger than they'd been in earlier entries, but no less precise. "Don't let the bastards win." He read it one more time. Then he closed the journal and put it carefully back in the box and locked it. He picked up his phone and called the one number he hadn't called yet. It rang 3 times. Then Sandra's voice, cautious, recognizing his number. "Daniel." "Hi," he said. A pause. 22 years of marriage and 2 years of a clean legal separation and 8 months of finalized divorce compressed into that one-syllable pause. "Hi," she said. "I saw the story in the Republic. I know. Helen Park mentioned she tried to reach you for comment. I told her I didn't have anything relevant to add. Another pause. That wasn't entirely true. I had things to say, she stopped. I didn't think it was my place anymore. A breath. Daniel, what you did with that station, what you found there. I'm calling because I wanted you to know the station opens tomorrow, he said. And because he stopped. Tried again. Because there was a time in our lives when something like this would have been something we shared. And I know that time is over, and I'm not calling to, he stopped again. He was not good at this part. Had never been good at this part. I just wanted you to know. That's all. The silence on the line was soft. I'm glad you found it, Sandra said. And the way she said it, not with the tired resignation he'd come to associate with the end of their marriage, but with something genuine, something that reached back across the years to a version of her that had believed in him long before he believed in himself, that hid him somewhere undefended. I always knew there was something in you worth finding again, she said. I just couldn't be the one to wait. I know, he said. I'm not calling to, I know. I know you know. A pause. Take care of yourself, Daniel. I mean it. You too. He hung up. He sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. Grief moved through him quiet and clean. Not the desperate, unprocessed grief of loss, but the cleaner, sadder kind that comes when you understand something clearly and understand at the same time that understanding it doesn't change it. Some things that break don't unbreak. Some damage is real and permanent. And the right response to it isn't to pretend otherwise, but to carry it honestly and let it make you more careful with the things that haven't broken yet. He put the phone in his pocket and went to check the pumps one more time. He didn't need to check them. Pete had checked them twice. The calibration was exact. The fuel, 2,000 gallons of regular, 1,000 of diesel delivered that morning, was in the tanks and the lines were clear and everything was certified and ready. But he went anyway because he was his father's son, and his father had always checked the pumps itself before any significant day. He stood at the pump island in the dark and put his hand on the pump. Housing Pete had restored them from old photographs matching the style as closely as modern equipment allowed, and he felt the particular solidity of a thing that is real and built properly and ready to work. He thought about what Roy had said. People are going to come. People want to put their money somewhere that means something. He thought about May Sutton and her alternator. She'd called 3 times since the first morning, asking about the opening date with the particular impatience of a woman who'd been driving 40 miles for service and was done with it. He thought about Bill Kramer, who had called 2 days ago and asked if he could bring some people from his church on opening day. There are folks around here who remember Earl, Bill had said. They'd like to see the place alive again. He thought about Helen Park's story, which had been shared 11,000 times on social media, a number that still struck him as somehow unreal because his understanding of the world had been formed in an era when news traveled slower, and the concept of 11,000 strangers reading about your father's gas station and feeling something about it was not something the mind arrived at naturally. He thought about a woman named Carol Demers who had emailed through the contact address Diane had set up for the station's new website. Yes, the station had a website now, which was another thing that struck him as somehow unreal, describing how her late husband had gotten his car repaired at Whitmore Fuel and Repair in 1994 when they broke down on their honeymoon drive to California. Earl wouldn't take full payment, she wrote. He said our alternator gave out because it was tired of getting us to the wedding, and now that the wedding was over, it could relax. He charged us for parts and not labor. My husband talked about that for years. He died 2 years ago. Knowing the station is coming back means something I don't have words for. He had read that email 4 times. He went back inside the office and sat down one last time and looked at the space his father had occupied for 30 years and the space he now occupied in his father's place. And he understood something he had been moving toward for 2 months without being able to see it clearly until now. This was not a story about a property dispute. It was not a story about a developer who lost and a family that won. It was not even at its core a story about a son honoring his father, though it was that too. It was a story about what holds, about what endures when everything argues against endurance, about a man who built something in 1971 because he believed in the idea of building something real and leaving it behind, and who held on to it against every pressure to let go, and who died believing he'd failed, not knowing that the thing he built would survive him, would wait for the person it was built for, would sit on a forgotten road for 22 years until that person was ready to find it. Earl Whitmore had not failed. He had planted something in ground that turned out to be more patient than anyone expected, and it had waited, and now it was alive. The opening day came with the particular quality of Arizona mornings in autumn, crisp and clear and bright without being hot, the kind of day that feels like the world is running at its best settings. Daniel was at the station by 5:30, which was earlier than he needed to be, but sleeping had not been a serious option. Curtis arrived at 6. He brought 2 thermoses of coffee and a look that combined profound satisfaction with the particular emotion of a man who had been waiting a very long time for a morning to arrive and was now finally standing in it. He handed Daniel one of the thermoses without a word. They drank. Roy showed up at 6:15 with Marcus in a pickup bed full of flowers that someone Daniel later learned it was Roy's wife, who had driven out from Tucson specifically for this, had arranged in simple buckets that were set along the edge of the lot. Not fancy, just alive and bright and there. Pete arrived with an air of professional composure that didn't entirely conceal the fact that he was moved. He inspected the pumps one more time, declared them exactly as he'd left them the night before, and then positioned himself near the first pump with the manner of someone who intended to personally witness the first transaction. Diane came with a new clipboard, ceremonial, she said, the old one having been retired in honor of the occasion. Tom LaGuardia parked at the edge of the lot and walked over with his hands in his pockets and said nothing, which meant everything. Helen Park was there with a photographer, which Daniel had agreed to. She was writing a follow-up piece, the opening of the station, as the bookend to the original story. The photographer was respectful and quiet and largely invisible, which was how it should be. May Sutton arrived at 8 o'clock before the official opening at 8:30 and didn't apologize for being early. She drove her truck directly to the first bay of the workshop, rolled down her window, and said to Daniel, "I've been waiting 6 weeks on that alternator." "Pull it in," he said. She pulled it in. He worked on it for 50 minutes. When he was done, he drove it around the lot 3 times listening, then brought it back and told her it was fixed. She paid him a fair rate without negotiation, the way a person pays for work they trust, and she looked at him before she drove away. "Your father would be pleased," she said. "That's the goal," he said. She drove off and he stood in the driveway of the workshop and watched her go. And the moment had the quality of completion, one small, specific, undramatic thing done well, which is what his father had built this place to do. Not heroics, not legacy projects. Just honest work repeated daily for whoever needed it. At 8:30, Daniel walked to the pump island. He didn't make a speech. He had considered making a speech. Curtis had suggested it, and Roy had said, if there was a speech, Roy was leaving, which was probably not true, but communicated his position clearly enough. In the end, Daniel turned on the pumps the way his father would have turned them on, the way any mechanic turns on equipment that's been properly prepared and is ready to do its job by flipping the switch and stepping back. The pumps came on. The display panels lit up. The fuel-ready indicators turned green. The equipment ran with a clean, steady hum that had no hesitation in it, no cough or stutter, just the confident sound of something functioning the way it was built to function. And then a truck pulled in. A man Daniel didn't know, mid-50s, driving a contractor's pickup with a tool trailer behind it, slowing and pulling to the pump with the practical purpose of someone who needed fuel and had seen the open sign and pulled in. He got out, ran his card, picked up the nozzle, and began fueling without drama, without apparent awareness that he was the first customer Whitmore Fuel and Repair had served in 22 years. Daniel watched him from across the lot. He felt something shift in his chest, a movement that had no name he could put to it, something between relief and grief and satisfaction, in the specific feeling of a thing becoming true that you were afraid might not. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then it settled into something quieter and more permanent. He looked at the crew. Roy was watching the fueling truck with his arms crossed in an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. Curtis had turned away and appeared to be looking at something in the middle distance that required his full attention. Pete had found something to do with his hands. Marcus took a photo on his phone with the self-consciousness of someone who doesn't normally take photos, but understood that this was a moment worth keeping. Tom stood beside Daniel. "There it is," Tom said. "There it is," Daniel said. The contractor finished fueling, replaced the nozzle, got back in his truck, and drove away. He'd been there 4 minutes. He probably wouldn't remember stopping here specifically, would file it as just a gas station on a highway, one of 100 stops on 100 working days. He didn't know what the place had cost. He didn't know about journals or quiet title actions, or 17 years of a legal fight frozen in time, or a man who died believing he'd failed. He just needed fuel, and he got it at a fair price from a pump that worked correctly. That was exactly right. That was exactly what it was supposed to be. By noon, 37 vehicles had stopped. Some were people who had read the story, they mentioned it, mentioned Earl, mentioned driving out specifically. Some were travelers who just saw an open sign on a road that had had no services for 22 years and stopped out of convenience. Some were locals who'd been aware of the rebuild and wanted to see it for themselves. Bill Kramer arrived with 9 people from his church who were not the kind of people who made a production of things, but who filled their tanks and bought coffee from the old machine Diane had restored to working condition and stood around for a while in the way that people stand around in a place they feel good about being. May Sutton came back in the afternoon to pick up her truck. She'd brought a friend, a woman her age, who drove a sedan that turned out to need a brake inspection, which Daniel performed on the spot, while both women sat in the office drinking coffee and talking to Curtis, who had appointed himself the unofficial host of the station with the serene confidence of someone who has found their correct role in a situation. Helen Park spent 3 hours on the property talking to people, taking notes, staying out of the way. At one point, she stood beside Daniel near the pump island and said, "How does it feel?" He thought about it. "Like work," he said. "Good work." She nodded. She wrote it down. Gerald Moss resigned from the County Planning Commission on the same day, a piece of news that reached Daniel via a text from Sandra Vega, who added nothing except 2 words. It happened. His resignation letter cited health reasons, which satisfied no one and was accepted by no one at face value, but was recorded and filed and would stand as the official record. The AG inquiry was ongoing and would continue at its own institutional pace, which was not fast but was not stopping. Daniel read the text about Moss while he was under a car in the workshop, a Toyota pickup with a coolant leak that a young woman had limped in on 20 minutes before. He read it, set the phone down, and went back to the coolant leak. What Moss's resignation meant precisely for the formal proceedings was something Navarro would explain in due time. What it meant in the immediate human sense was something Daniel felt without needing. It explained one of the men who had been part of the machinery that ground his father down had now been ground down himself, not by vengeance, not by deliberate destruction, but by the simple, inexorable process of accountability finding its level. His father had documented the wrong. Daniel had picked up the documentation and carried it to people who could act on it, and the action had reached its natural conclusion. He thought about Earl writing in the journal about fairness, about the thing that made him unable to sell, not just love for Daniel, not just stubbornness, but a fundamental bedrock unwillingness to let wrong things stand because someone with money expected him to. Earl Whitmore had been a mechanic from Oklahoma with a junior high education and 200 borrowed dollars, and he had understood at a bone level that the thing you do when something is wrong is not accept it. Daniel had inherited that, had spent 30 years expressing it in ways that were not always useful or well-directed in an organization that had its own relationship with legality and its own complicated ethics. But the core of it, the fundamental refusal, was his father's, and he'd had it all along, and it had brought him here. The sun had moved to the west by the time the afternoon slowed. The crew gathered naturally in the workshop as the business of the day wound down, and there was a comfortable, depleted ease among them, the ease of people who have worked hard and done what they came to do. Roy was cleaning tools, which was how Roy processed emotions through the hands, through the disciplined care of things that needed care. Marcus was on his phone talking to his wife, his voice warm in a way it wasn't often in public. Pete was writing something in a small notebook he kept in his chest pocket, probably a technical note, probably the kind of detail that only a man who thinks in systems would bother recording, but maybe something else tonight. Diane had her old clipboard in her lap, the retired one which she'd brought after all, and which she was using to make notes that Daniel suspected were not permit-related. Curtis was asleep in the office chair and had been for 20 minutes, and nobody had said a word about it because Curtis had earned every minute of that sleep. Tom was sitting on the workshop couch with a cup of coffee, quiet in the way. He was often quiet, not absence, but presence turned inward. Daniel leaned in the doorway and looked at them. These were his people, not in the way the angels had been his people, not through patch and ritual, in the specific codes of a closed brotherhood. In a different way, in the way people become yours when they show up for something real and give it everything they've got and don't ask for anything back except that the thing be worth it. The thing was worth it. He thought about the 48 hours after he'd first found the journal, the particular isolation of those 2 days alone in the station, reading his father's private thoughts, the weight of 20 years of misunderstanding, settling into him, the grief of it, the disorienting quality of having the story of your own past rewritten from the ground up. He had been so alone in those hours. He was not alone now. He pushed off the doorway and walked into the workshop and sat down on the old workbench and looked at the people in the room and said, "I want to say one thing and then I'm done talking for the day." Roy looked up from the tools. Everyone turned to look at him. "My father built this place for me," Daniel said. "He just didn't know how to say it, and I didn't know how to see it. And we both spent the 20 years being too stubborn and too proud and too afraid to close the distance." He paused. "I don't want to make that same mistake again. So I'm saying it straight, you people are the reason this happened. Not just the legal stuff, not just the rebuild, the whole of it, the fact that I didn't quit, the fact that I had something to fight with, that was you." He looked around the room. "I know most of you have lives to get back to, jobs, families, all of it. And I know the time you spent here was time you didn't have to give. I want you to know that I understand what that means." He stopped. "That's it. That's all." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Curtis from the office chair without opening his eyes. "You said you were done talking." Laughter, the real kind. Daniel sat on the workbench and let the sound of it fill the space around him. This space his father had built with borrowed money and calloused hands, and a refusal to stop this space that had been dark for 22 years and was alive and full again. Later, after the crew had gone, Daniel locked the workshop and stood in the lot for a while. He could hear the highway faint, distant, the sound of moving things. Above him, the restored sign caught the last of the evening light. Whitmore Fuel and Repair. Established 1971. Red and black on clean wood. His father's sign, his father's colors, his father's year. He reached into his pocket and took out the key. He had carried it every day since he found it, had turned it over in his hand in 100 moments of uncertainty and pressure and doubt, had held it when he felt like walking away when the fight seemed too large and the resources too small and the odds too long. It was old metal worn smooth where his thumb pressed most often, and it had the specific weight of something that has been handled by two different people in two different eras for the same fundamental reason. His father had kept it because some things were worth protecting. Daniel had carried it because some fights were worth finishing. He looked at the sign one more time. He thought about the morning he turned onto this road, no plan, no destination, nothing but a name on a faded sign and some pull he couldn't name. He thought about the waitress with the cold coffee and the thing she'd said, "You just can't see it yet from where you're standing." He could see it now. He closed his fingers around the key, walked back to the station and locked up for the night. The first night of a business that was open, certified, and ready for tomorrow. Earl Whitmore had built this place from nothing and held it against everything and left it for a son who wasn't ready to receive it. Daniel Whitmore had come back, found what his father left finished, what his father started, and opened the door. The station was alive, and the name above it would stand for as long as there were Whitmores willing to stand with it, which as it turned out was exactly what his father had believed all along. Some things hold. Some men keep their promises across death and distance and decades of silence. And sometimes the road a man spends his whole life running from is the one that was always waiting to bring him home.